Written by Magnum Kramer. Yes, I'm a phony, but not a shyster nor a con man. I've never tricked anyone out of their money. Really, given there aren't any codified formal standards for what constitutes a paranormal investigator, phony is a relative term. I did have a genuine interest in the paranormal as a skeptic before all the madness. I've watched videos on YouTube about unexplainable events, ghost phenomena, haunting psychology, and occult symbology. I didn't believe any of it to be real, I just thought it was cool. It was a hobby. I just want to be clear, I never intended to do any harm. In fact, the opposite is true. I wanted to help, and that's how I fell into this job. Apologies for the opening rant, I just wanted to make sure all that was clear from the get-go. My name is, well, let's go with Peter, and my real job was building inspector. Yeah, I'm that guy everyone hates because I have to tell them they didn't do the job right the first time. Well, that's the stereotype, at least, as far as I know. I'm fairly well-liked. Of course, I generally work with people that can do the job right the first time, so, you know. My trade comes with a lot of cool gadgets, like a thermal camera to check for insulation leaks, an electromagnetic field detector to check for bad wiring, and useful knowledge about electrical, plumbing, air ducting, etc. These trade tools and skills ended up being the start of my current job. It started a few years back when my old buddy, let's call him Lewis, and I were having a boys' night out at our favorite tavern. Lewis is an accountant, married to a lovely woman, has 2 little kids he loves dearly, but he had a problem that was driving him nuts. They had recently moved into a new house, and his wife and kids were convinced it was haunted. Strange noises, flickering lights, cold spots, etc. All the usual sorts of phenomena that can usually be explained by loose ducts, pipes, bad wiring, and poor insulation. Lewis had tried to convince his family that there had to be a rational explanation for it all, but they were all so scared, so worked up they had convinced themselves it was a ghost, that they have to leave, all that nonsense. It was so bad the kids were struggling in school due to lack of sleep, and Lewis and his wife were constantly on each other's nerves. It was then I had the most brilliant idea ever, that I would later come to regret. I told Lewis hauntings are all about psychology. People think there is something to be scared of, so they get scared. It doesn't matter if the thing they're scared of is real or not. Thus, I reasoned if fear could be caused by something thought to be scary, perhaps it could be cured by something thought to deal with the scary thing. I remembered seeing this tell-all story about a fortune teller once. She explained people don't really want their fortunes told, they just want good news, and they want to believe it. That's what she really did, figured out what her customers wanted and put on a big, mystical show and told them what they wanted to hear. I could do the same thing for Lewis's family. So I proposed a plan. Go home, tell your wife and kids your friend the paranormal investigator is coming tomorrow to get rid of the haunting. We'll make a big show of the whole thing to sell it psychologically. Then I'll go over the pipe work, electrical, and whatnot. I help you fix whatever is really creating the bumps in the night, and that should solve the haunting. Lewis agreed. I arrived the next day to put on the show. I went for this whole Ghostbuster-esque, science-based approach to occultism. I told Lewis's wife and kids about my trade tools and how they were used both for home inspection and ghost hunting, and we made a sort of game of checking the house out. We laid down some newspapers and the kids helped me draw protective wards from magically infused salt. which was just table salt from a bottle marked with occult runes I had found online. I made sure to draw real protection symbols because I knew the kids would look them up online just like I did. I burned some sage with a few nice-smelling herbs to cleanse negative emotions and energies. Again, something I learned from YouTube. As I had expected, we found some old wiring that needed new insulation. EM fields can cause feelings of paranoia. A few loose pipes and some old insulation that needed to be replaced. We got everything fixed up, and soon after, the ghost was gone. My paranormal investigator career should have ended there, but it didn't. Turns out Lewis's wife was way into the occult and paranormal. I mean, she has special teas and crystals. She was part of multiple paranormal related groups on Facebook, the whole 9 yards. And she had fallen for my act, hook, line, and sinker. She decided to tell all of her friends about how I had saved her family from the ghost. And the next thing I know, I'm getting calls and messages from people asking me to investigate their hauntings. Now, I could have just ignored them, or just explained it was all an act, but there was a problem. What would happen if word got back to Lewis's wife and kids that I was a fake? I couldn't be sure, but probably nothing good. Of course, this was also an opportunity. What was I really doing with the Ghostbuster stuff? I was home inspecting, just with an extra bit of showmanship and improving. So I figured I'd run with it. I'd tell people to call my company and schedule a home inspection, which is what I had to call my paranormal investigation work for tax reasons. And I'd just do the whole show and get paid to do my job. I didn't even charge extra. Even if some people offered to tip me, I always turned it down. I made good money just doing my job. I didn't need extra. Well, at the time I didn't. I would come to regret not making the extra money after the pandemic hit. The unfortunate design flaw in the profession of home inspector is that you have to be able to go inside the homes to inspect them. If people are afraid of a deadly virus, that doesn't happen so much. After 3 months of not being able to do any jobs, the company I worked for went belly up. Small town companies not being too big to fail. I was now unemployed, and trying to find a new job during a pandemic was like trying to squeeze blood from a stone. Financially, I would be alright for a while, but as of this telling, the pandemic is still going, and I've even seen reports of some places having second wave outbreaks, which says to me it's not getting fixed anytime soon. So one day, I got a message on Facebook. Someone tried to contact the company to schedule me for a haunting inspecting. That's what we ended up calling it. And found out the company was gone. I explained what happened, and then they asked if they could just hire me directly. Maybe pay me under the table if taxes are an issue. They were quick to add that normally they would never propose such a thing, but they feared for the well-being of their 2-year-old and their spouse was serving overseas. Now, just to be clear, tax reasons, as you've probably surmised, was just a cover on my part to explain why the professional paranormal investigator had a day job. Just another part of the act, really. I hesitated as I thought about how to reply to the message. Everything I had done so far was above board. In terms of legality, I had been paid to inspect a home, and that's what I had done every time. I just happened to do some other stuff as a free service to give families peace of mind. Of course, that wasn't an option anymore. I'll spare you the legal BS, but essentially I couldn't legally or certifiably do home inspections without being part of a licensed company. The laws are weird here. Of course, there were no laws against selling peace of mind. I had an N95 respirator as part of my trade tools, and I mean the real deal with replaceable filters and eye protection, so the virus wouldn't be a problem. What if I just went over and did my thing? Most of the little repairs I could do myself. Anything I couldn't handle, I could recommend to a friend that could. and they needed the work just like I did. All the Ghostbuster stuff would still be technically free, so I knew I wouldn't be conning anyone. So I agreed to help. Turned out they had a lot of bad wiring, and an infestation of a mold that could cause hallucinations. It was no wonder they were seeing things. Well, the requests kept coming, and I kept doing my bit. Things were fine till last Saturday, and my most recent case. Now, keep in mind, I had encountered some weird things while doing this job. Like, one time, the ghost turned out to be a psycho that had been living in the walls of the client's house. I just about screamed when I spotted him with my thermal camera. A few of the haunting cases turned out to be stalkers. Heck, there was this one time I had to knock out a punk with my monkey wrench when he tried to break in. This last case, though, even with all my experience, there were things I can't explain. I'll do my best to recount the events. The client lived in a huge manor house in a heavily forested area. It was a really old place, one of those turn-of-the-century constructions that had been added on to and updated over the decades. The clients were a family of 5. The husband, whom I'll call Winston, was a nurse. The wife, Dana, a school teacher. They had one daughter, Janine, in her 20s, who was living with them because she lost her job during the pandemic. There was a 10-year-old boy, Raymond, and a baby boy, Oscar. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself the same question I did when I first saw their home. How did they afford a huge manor type of place on those 2 salaries? Well, turns out there was a good reason, though I didn't discover it till shortly before I began recording this. I pulled into the driveway and found Winston waiting for me. Even before I got out of my truck, I could tell he was on edge. Keep in mind, he was a big dude, well built. He struck me as the type that could handle himself in a dicey situation, yet his hands trembled as he waved to me. I also noticed he had set up a lawn chair in a sheltered spot near the garage, which meant he felt more comfortable waiting for me outside on a cold, windy day rather than inside his own house. Something must have spooked him good. I pulled on my mask and hopped out of the truck. Before I could even introduce myself, he jogged over to me and started talking up a storm. "Thank God you're here," was all I could make out before his speech devolved into overly excited nonsense and frantic hand waving. It took me a few moments of my own gesturing to get him to calm down enough that I could actually talk to him. Winston, calm down. Ghosts feed on fear. You have to calm down or you'll just make it stronger. That was a popular theory with the ghost hunting community. It was one of those pearls of wisdom I used as part of my act. I hoped it would be enough to get through to him. Winston looked briefly alarmed and began to settle down. I tried to encourage him. Deep breaths. Relax. Where is the rest of your family? I had been expecting 5, but only met him thus far. I had a sudden worrying thought that maybe the reason he was so panicked was someone was in immediate danger. Dana and Janie took the kids out. They'll be back later. I figured it would be safer if they weren't here for this, Winston explained between ragged, slow breaths. Honestly, if it weren't for the damn pandemic, we'd all be in a hotel or something. He looked me up and down, sizing me up. How can you be so calm when you deal with this paranormal stuff all the time? He asked in an almost pleading tone. The real answer was, I know all this paranormal stuff is fake, but I didn't say that, of course. Instead, I shrugged and opened the side door of my truck. It's all about professionalism. I began calmly and methodically equipping my gear, as if everything that was going on was just another day on the job for me. I'm supposed to be the expert, right? If I start panicking, then everyone else is going to as well. So no matter what, I will never show fear. I get scared, sure. I've had a few nasty encounters, but So long as I act like I'm not afraid, I tend to not feel so scared. Fake it till you make it, like they say. In truth, Winston's nervous disposition had me on edge, but true to my own advice, I wasn't showing it. He nodded slowly. Right, professionalism, okay. He let out a long, slow breath. All right, so tell me what's going on in your house. I made a big show of bringing out my Ghostbuster gear, such as the bottle of magic salt I talked about earlier, and my photon buster, which was another prop I came up with for showing off to kids. It's just a high-powered flashlight with an engraved lens. I had researched banishment runes online and scratched them into the plastic so the symbols projected like the bat signal. There's so much I hardly know where to start, he began with a sigh. Well, start at the beginning. What did you notice first? I prompted, and we began walking to the front door. He struggled for a moment as he tried to collate the contents of his memory. Well, it started with little things. We'd hear odd noises at night, felt cold spots, lights flickered. I had heard all that before, but the next part surprised me. So I had a buddy come in and check out the wiring and whatnot, assuming there was a mundane explanation. He found and fixed a few issues, but the phenomenon didn't stop. This was the first time I had ever done one of these things after someone had already done what I was planning to do. At the time, I reasoned the buddy might have been an amateur, thus hadn't found every issue, or maybe he didn't do the fixes right. Winston continued. After a while, we had gotten used to the little quirks, but things started getting worse. Objects would move when no one was looking. On at least 3 occasions, I set my coffee mug on the table, turned away for a moment, and found it tipped over and spilling on the floor. I thought maybe I'd knocked it over by accident the first time, but by the third, I knew I hadn't. I wrote that one off as clumsiness and denial. Sometimes people blame ghosts for losing their keys and wallet. And it just kept getting worse. Soon we'd find paintings on the floor, furniture toppled over, books pulled off the shelf and stacked on the floor. He listed off a few more things. Most of them I could write off as exaggerations, people forgetting to close drawers, or a bored 10-year-old trapped indoors making a mess. I thought I had it all figured out when Winston dropped the bombshell. It got really bad when I opened the hidden room. And then there's what happened in the kitchen this morning. I paused just short of the front stoop. Hold on, secret room? And what was that about the kitchen? Winston opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't seem to find the words. After several long moments, he finally said, "You'll just have to see it for yourself." He opened the door and gestured for me to enter. Unconsciously, my hand rested on the handle of my monkey wrench as I walked in. I didn't know what to expect now. I stepped through the threshold and immediately felt a chill run down my spine, causing me to shudder involuntarily. "You feel it?" Winston asked as he stepped in behind me and closed the door, but didn't lock it, as if he thought he needed to get out in a hurry. "Chilly in here," I admitted. I heard a familiar beeping as I realized my EMF detector was on and going utterly nuts. I turned it off, figuring there must have been some bad wiring on the doorbell or something. "Kitchen is this way." Winston gestured with a shaky hand and timidly began walking down the hall. We reached the kitchen. Winston stopped at the entrance and refused to take another step. I walked in and, well, it was just plain unreal. Someone had taken every knife from the butcher's block and shoved them into the 10-foot-high ceiling hard enough to make them stick. Every drawer and cabinet was wide open, and every item, pots, pans, boxed foods, fruits, etc., was placed on the floor, arranged by size order. The refrigerator, a huge 2-door model that must have weighed at least 300 pounds, was upside down, as if someone had managed to lift the entire thing up and flip it over. The doors were hanging open and the contents of the fridge had violently spilled out onto the floor in a sticky mess of broken eggs, milk, and juices. The mixture of fluids was smeared across the floor, up the wall to the ceiling, as if a dozen hands had dragged the mess around. I blinked as I took in the scene. Most of it I could explain away, but the refrigerator, the knife shoved into the ceiling, who or what could even do that? Winston's question snapped me out of my confused stupor. Have you ever seen anything like this before? There was a frightened tremor in his voice. I could see the fear and the pain of having his home, his family's safe haven, so violated in his eyes. Without really thinking, I answered out of reflex. Yes, twice. The first time it was staged. I had one guy trying to debunk me, to expose me as a fraud, which I sort of am, I suppose. He set up a fake haunted house with various tricks and spooky events to make me think it was actually haunted. Of course, I ended up catching on to his plan and his scheme failed. He did a lousy job installing some of his tricks. I ended up fixing a few of them for him. I might have thought Winston was trying to pull the same thing, but I could see the pain and fear in his eyes. If he was putting on an act, it was Oscar-worthy. I continued. The second time, I fell silent as I thought about the moment I found the intruder hiding in the wall of a previous client's home. I felt the air in the room suddenly grow colder and shivered involuntarily. I swallowed and took a good long look around before turning to Winston and saying, "Have you called the cops yet?" Winston winced and half nodded. "We've had to call them several times over the months. They came out a few times and checked the house top to bottom. They never found anything. I think it's to the point they're not taking me seriously anymore. I called them just before I called you, and they haven't arrived yet." It was time to get out. Whatever was going on around here was beyond me. It would take at least 3 really strong guys to flip that refrigerator, and they might still be in the house waiting to strike. "We'll call the cops again and wait for them outside. It's not safe." And I was suddenly interrupted by a woman's scream. It shattered the quiet like a hammer to a mirror. I felt my heart jump into my throat and I had to swallow hard to force it back down. Winston's eyes shot wide open as he heard it, then called out his wife's name in terror. He turned and ran towards the source of the scream before I could stop him. Dana should have still been out with the kids. It couldn't have been her, but I doubted Winston was in the proper mindset to realize that fact. Of course, if it wasn't her, who or what the hell was it? I hesitated a moment, deciding between Winston not wanting to let him face whatever threats there may be alone, or running outside to safety and calling the professionals to handle this. I ran after Winston, reasoning he was likely in immediate danger, and I was the only one around that could help him. It was a struggle to keep up with Winston. He was in full panic mode, and I was carrying around a bunch of heavy tools. I caught a glimpse of him as he turned a corner and began trotting down the stairs into the basement. I made to follow him, but paused for a moment after something odd caught my attention. The basement door was secured via a rope, so it couldn't be closed. One end of the rope was tied to the door handle, the other was secured to a hook screwed into the wall. I puzzled for a moment as to why it was like that, but soon Winston's frantic call for his wife down in the basement reminded me of the more pressing matters. I made my way down into the basement. The sudden chillness in the air took me by surprise. I felt the need to rub my arms to warm them up. I found Winston running around frantically opening cabinets, checking rooms, just tearing the place whilst calling his wife's name. "Winston, I cried out. "She's not here. Remember, she's out with the kids." He didn't even acknowledge me. I ended up having to grab him by both shoulders and shaking him as I reminded him his wife couldn't possibly be here. The veil of fear and madness finally lifted from his eyes. "But I heard her scream," he protested. "I heard the scream too, but you already told me she took the kids away from here for safety's sake. She wouldn't come back until the problem is dealt with, right?" My words seemed to sink in, and he relaxed and spent a moment trying to catch his breath. I was rather winded myself and leaned against the wall as I gasped for air. It was hard to take deep breaths due to the mask, but I knew more or less how to. My eyes happened to settle on something my brain couldn't make sense of. What the heck is that?" I gestured to an opening in the basement wall. It was hinged like a partially open door, but just looked like a wall. There was no door frame or handle, just an angled section of the wall leading to an open space behind. Without even having to look, Winston answered, "That's the hidden room we found last night. All the really weird stuff happened after we opened it." The air coming from the secret room smelled like stagnation and death, even through the mask, and I had just changed the filters, so how I could even smell it was a mind-boggler. The inside of the room was darker than a moonless night, as if the light from the rest of the basement was unable to pierce its abyss. I used my thermal camera to look inside, but I didn't dare cross the threshold. The room was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the basement, and I mean right up to the hidden door, which should not have been thermodynamically possible. With the aid of the thermal vision, I could see the contents of the room. A table, large hooks hanging from the ceiling, a drain in the middle of the floor, a rack of butcher's tools. By this point, I had a dozen questions jockeying for attention in my mind. The one that came to the forefront of the moment was, "Winston, why do you have this room in your house?" "I didn't know it was there, I swear," he replied defensively. I hadn't meant my question to be an accusation, but it must have come across that way. "Just happened to find the hidden door cracked open last night, and I opened it up the rest of the way to take a look inside. I'm pretty sure it's the source of the haunting." I stood there, stunned, unable to form a coherent sentence to speak. More questions filled my mind. Was this real? Is this place actually haunted? Where had the scream come from? Was this all a setup? One in particular, though, that had been at the back of my mind, demanding attention, suddenly came to the forefront. I asked him, "Winston, why is there a rope keeping the basement door open?" In an almost offhand manner, he answered, "It slammed shut on Janine once, trapping her down here. Some sort of force must have been holding it closed because it took me, Dana, and a crowbar to get it back open, even though it doesn't have a lock." Above us there was a loud tearing sound, and then a wooden slam. We were both startled by the noise and then looked up the stairs. Sure enough, the door was now closed. I could see the part of the rope that was still tied to the handle hanging limp. Judging by the fraying, the two halves of the rope had been torn apart. "No, no, no, no," Winston chanted as he raced up the stairs and began shoulder ramming the door in an attempt to break it open. The air suddenly grew colder, so cold I could see the fog of my breath puffing through my respirator's vents. The lights began to dim and flicker, threatening to go out. I focused on staying calm, reasoning this could all still be some sort of test or the work of some home invaders. But all that went out the window the moment I saw the thing manifesting in the dark of the secret room. I couldn't really see it with my eyes, mind you. In fact, if I hadn't happened to look into the room with my thermal camera that very moment, I might have never known it was there. I watched through on the LCD screen as a swirling vortex of cold air formed in the room from seemingly nowhere and began gradually pulling itself into a monstrous human shape. It was at that moment I realized just how screwed we are. This was it. This was an actual haunted house. This wasn't someone's test. This wasn't some home invader's elaborate plan. Something I could not explain was happening before my very eyes. The inky darkness of the shadows in the hidden room began to slither forth like the tentacles of some Lovecraftian nightmares. I was shocked, so dumbstruck and stunned at what was going on I didn't even react till one of the tendrils touched the toe of my boot. And I felt a sudden icy coldness in my toes, like dipping them into a frozen lake. The pain was enough to snap me out of my stunned state and send me running to the stairs. When I reached them and started climbing, I stopped and, due to some sudden inspiration, drew a line of salt and a protection symbol across the first step. I guess because I had done something similar so many times, it felt natural to do it while in a panic or something. Winston was still banging on the door, trying to get it open. I moved next to him and began slamming into it with him. I tried the knob, it turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge. It just felt as if something was holding it closed by pressing against the other side. The inky tendrils of darkness kept creeping towards us as the void seemed to swallow any light, maybe even the basement itself. Think of it like a wall of pure black, slowly closing in on us. There was no way we could get out in time. The door was just starting to buckle, but we couldn't get it open fast enough. I had almost sat down and given up. But then the strangest thing yet happened. The darkness got to my line of salt and suddenly halted. I heard a frustrated roar echo from the depths of the darkness as the hungry voice pushed against an invisible wall. Winston turned and saw the salt holding back the darkness, then he looked to me. "You're the actual real deal," he declared with a renowned vigor in his voice. "I guess so," I answered back and redoubled my efforts. "Same time, on 3, I suggested and indicated the door. My partner nodded. 1, 2, 3. We slammed into the door, causing it to buckle and crack. 1, 2. I faltered as the stairs beneath my feet suddenly shook violently, as if a giant hand had grabbed them and began thrashing violently. I looked back and, realizing the shaking was scattering the salt I had laid down. Our protective wall was crumbling. Winston looked back and realized the same thing. We exchanged a glance at the same time. We shouted, 3, and slammed into the door, busting through in a storm of splinters. We fell through, then scrambled to our feet. Winston slammed what was left of the door closed behind us and propped it closed with a chair wedged under the handle. I drew a wide semicircle of salt around the door and chair and quickly drew every useful symbol I could think of. I was startled by the door suddenly shaking as if struck by something on the other side. I almost stepped on the circle, which would have broken it. Thankfully, Winston was there to help me regain my balance. "How long will the salt hold?" he asked. "No clue," I answered. "Let's just get the hell out of here." The light suddenly flickered out and the floor beneath our feet began trembling as if it were an earthquake. The inky black shadows began oozing up through the floorboards like rising floodwaters. I didn't have enough salt to cover the entire floor, so escape was our only option. We sprinted towards the front door in a panic. Winston was screaming, asking, "What the hell is going on?" My only response was, "Just keep running." We made it into the hallway and it was dark due to the lights going out, so I took a flashlight from my tool belt and flicked it on. We ran down the hall, but Winston suddenly skidded to a stop in front of me and I accidentally ran into him. I was about to ask him why he halted when the answer became apparent. There were branches of shadows blocking the exit like a wall of a hedge maze. We could see the front door and the safe haven of outdoors just on the other side of the barrier, but couldn't get through. Winston grabbed a potted flower off a nearby table and threw it at the barrier, maybe to break through or just out of anger. The pot shattered against the shadows as if it were a brick wall. I tried flinging my salt at it, but it didn't seem to have any effect. The wall of creeping darkness had already blocked off the way we came, and the only door in the hallway we could reach led to a closet. I scanned around frantically with my flashlight, looking for any possible options when Winston suddenly grabbed my hand. "Your light! Shine it on the branches!" he shouted as he forcefully directed the beam. When the light touched the shadowy branches, they began to tremble and shrink. I didn't understand why at first, but then I realized I had accidentally grabbed my photon buster flashlight. Any branches touched by the projected banishing rune were withering away as if touched by a flame. Just before the encroaching wall of darkness could reach us, we burned a hole through the blockade and slammed through the front door. Never had the warmth of daylight felt so good as when we emerged from that haunted house. Winston's family had just pulled into the driveway when we emerged from the nightmare. A woman I presumed to be Dana exited her van and helped her husband off the ground. She looked and saw the wall of shadow chasing after us. "What in God's name is that?" she screamed. Winston took a hold of her and began directing her back to the van, shouting for his family to get out of there. They all quickly piled into the van and peeled out. I was right behind them in my truck. So, now we come to the present, to me recording this now. Winston and his family are staying with me at my place. We're all fine. We had some concerns about the pandemic, but frankly, compared to everything else that happened, it doesn't seem like much of a pressing issue anymore. We tried calling the cops, but they didn't believe a word of what we said. As of right now, I'm at a loss. There is clearly some evil force running rampant through Winston's home. In fact, I did some research about the place and found some dark history. The manor was once the home of a serial killer back in the 1880s. He managed to avoid justice for years, thanks to being the brother of the town's mayor. Eventually, the citizens of the town took justice into their own hands. They broke into the manor in the middle of the night and killed him in his own kitchen. Over the decades, dozens of families have lived in the home, but never more than a few months at a time. Winston and Dana have been told by the realtor there were reports the place was haunted, but at the time they didn't believe in the supernatural. To them, it was just old rumors that had thankfully brought the price of the home down enough for them to be able to afford it. I find myself scoffing at this. The American dream turned into a nightmare out of hell. Thus, I turned to the internet, to anyone hearing this. Winston, Dana, and their children need help. They're looking to me to give it to them, but I don't know what to do. If there is anyone out there who can help in any way, please reply. I may be a phony, but I'm not heartless. I'm not leaving them to try and deal with this on their own. Thank you for listening. You can probably handle another horror story, right?